The snow piled around my bare feet on the porch that night, the string lights behind me blinking like they were mocking every ounce of pain running through my chest. My mother's voice was still ringing in my ears, sharp enough to cut through the freezing wind, telling me I could never manage anything on my own. My name is Aubrey Sinclair, and on Christmas Eve, my own parents threw me out of the house I grew up in and locked the door behind me, like I was nothing more than trash they had finally worked up the courage to remove. Growing up as a Sinclair meant living inside a performance. My father, Walter, cared more about appearances than affection, obsessing over how our family looked to the neighbors while never once asking how I actually felt. My mother, Diane, measured love in usefulness rather than warmth, and my younger brother, Tyler, learned early that mocking me at the dinner table was a reliable way to earn her approval. The only person who ever made me feel like I genuinely mattered was my grandfather, Elias Whitfield, a quiet, humble man who wore the same gray cardigan for years and looked at me like I was worth something nobody else in that house could see. He used to sit with me in his backyard for hours, telling stories while my parents argued inside. And even as a child I could sense the sadness behind his eyes whenever he looked at me, as if he already knew something I did not. That night, everything collapsed the moment I refused to co-sign a loan to bail out Tyler's failing business. Within minutes I was branded selfish, ungrateful, and a burden they could no longer tolerate. A garbage bag stuffed with random junk, not my clothes, not my documents, not a single thing that actually belonged to me, was shoved into my arms, and I was pushed outside into the freezing night with no coat, no phone service, and $18 left in my bank account. I stood there staring at the door, listening to the lock click into place, while a few neighbors peeked through their curtains and pretended they had not just witnessed my own family throw me away like garbage. Sitting in my freezing car with my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel, I felt something solid inside my coat pocket. It was an old black card my grandfather had given me when I was 6 years old, with strict instructions to use it only if I ever had nowhere left to turn. I had almost forgotten about it, tucked away like a childhood memory, but that night, staring at the warm windows of the house I could no longer enter, it felt like the only thread keeping me from completely falling apart. I drove to a 24-hour diner because it was the only place I could sit without being thrown out into the cold again, and I spent the rest of that night nursing the same cup of coffee, terrified of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning, running on no sleep and barely functioning, I walked into Cumberland Heritage Trust with the card shaking in my palm. The branch manager, a composed man named Nathaniel Cross, studied it with visible surprise before quietly asking me to follow him into a private office. When he pulled up the account attached to it, his expression shifted from polite professionalism to something closer to disbelief, because the numbers glowing on that screen shattered everything I thought I understood about my grandfather's life. $63 million sat in that account, along with property deeds across 3 counties and shares in companies I recognized from the evening news. My grandfather, the man my parents dismissed as broke, forgetful, and irrelevant, had quietly built an empire, hiding it from the very people who spent years trying to steal it from him. Inside a sealed folder marked strictly for my eyes, I found the truth my parents had buried for over a decade. Letters my grandfather wrote to me that were intercepted and hidden before I ever saw them. Medical evaluations proving he was completely competent when he built this fortune. Legal filings documenting my parents' attempts to have him declared mentally unfit so they could seize control of everything he owned. When he refused to hand over power of attorney, they punished him by cutting me off from him entirely, feeding me years of lies about a man who never once stopped loving me. Reading his final letter nearly broke something open inside my chest. He wrote that if I was reading these words, it meant they had finally revealed who they truly were. And he wanted me to know I was never a burden, never unwanted, and that everything he built was meant to hand me the freedom they had spent my whole life denying me. I barely had time to process the weight of what had just landed in my lap before the threats started rolling in. Unknown numbers demanding I return what belonged to the family. A gray sedan trailing my car through parking lots with quiet, deliberate patience. A note slipped under my hotel door warning that I could not hide from what was coming. My attorney, a sharp and fearless woman named Camille Reyes, confirmed my worst fear almost immediately. My parents had hired a private investigator to track my every move, hoping to manufacture a case declaring me mentally unstable so a court would hand them control of the inheritance instead. In the middle of that chaos, I met Dr. Julian Reed, a cardiologist who happened to catch me the moment I nearly collapsed from exhaustion outside a small cafe downtown. He never demanded explanations. He simply made sure I ate something warm, made sure I had somewhere safe to sit and think, and slowly became the steady presence I did not realize I had been starving for after years surrounded by people who only valued me for what I could give them. When the sedan finally showed up while he was with me, he stepped between me and the street without hesitation, and for the first time in years I understood what it felt like to have someone choose to protect me without expecting anything in return. The court hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. My parents' attorney painted me as erratic, emotionally unstable, and dangerously influenced by outside parties, claiming I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly man into rewriting his entire estate. Camille dismantled their story piece by piece, presenting medical records, intercepted letters, and old security footage showing my father attempting to coerce my grandfather into signing over his assets years earlier. When the judge finished reviewing the evidence, the petition against me was thrown out entirely, and a restraining order was issued against my parents instead. The victory did not end the danger right away. The private investigator was arrested for tampering with my mail and tracking my car without consent. And under pressure, he confessed that my parents had known about the inheritance for months, tipped off by someone inside the bank who violated confidentiality rules. Everything, including throwing me out on Christmas Eve, had been a calculated setup designed to make me look unstable and easier to manipulate once the money surfaced. Soon after, my parents attempted one final desperate move, filing a petition claiming I had exploited a vulnerable elder, but a recorded video my grandfather had left behind, calmly explaining his reasoning and confirming his own competence, destroyed their case completely. Staying with Julian through the worst of it gave me something I had never experienced growing up, a sense of safety that came with no conditions attached. Slowly, through quiet mornings, honest conversations, and small steady gestures, I began imagining a future that was not shaped by fear, obligation, or survival, something that finally belonged only to me. He never pushed me to talk before I was ready, and he never once made me feel like a burden for needing time to heal. Weeks later, the investigation into my parents concluded with formal criminal charges, and the final court documents confirmed everything I already carried in my heart. I had been the victim of years of manipulation, not the perpetrator, and the estate my grandfather built in complete secrecy was now fully, legally, and permanently mine. By early spring, Julian and I moved into a small brick house on a quiet street, nothing extravagant, just a place where afternoon light spilled across the floors and no one could ever again tell me I was unworthy of it. I visited my grandfather's grave not long after settling in, kneeling in the grass to thank him for believing in me long before I ever learned to believe in myself, and for the first time in my life, I finally felt whole. If you have ever been discarded by the very people who were supposed to protect you, I hope my story reminds you that your worth was never theirs to define. Sometimes the people who try hardest to break you accidentally hand you every tool you need to finally become whole.